Thank you for joining me on the journey. This is Completed Christianity. So welcome back, another episode of Being Complete. Today we're going to get into our first episode of our 6-day prophecy discussions, talking about prophecy interpretation. So let's jump right in and take a look at what we got going on here. First, the idea of scripture interpretation, it comes through basically 3 different methods, and that is preterist, historicist, and futurist. And we're going to take a look at all 3 of these today. When the Reformation began, they were coming out of the Dark Ages, where people were not allowed to read the scripture in the Dark Ages unless you were a priest. And then if you were a priest, you were also told the interpretation of what it meant. Oh, it says that? No, it means this. It doesn't mean what it says. It means what we say it says. So this was going on in the Dark Ages, hence the term Dark Ages. Well, the Reformation brought us out of that. And people like Luther here, as a Catholic priest, he began to translate the scriptures into a common language. So before it was only in Latin, he began translating in his own language, which is German. And as he was doing that, he's also reading other writings of people like Wycliffe and others who had come before him a century or so. So he's looking at these things, and he's reading the scriptures, and he's saying, hey, this isn't what we're doing. The scriptures say completely the opposite of things that we're doing. So this is what sparked the Reformation, by Luther seeing these things. And he puts down 95 different things, nails them to the church in Wittenberg, Germany. And these things sparked the Reformation. And it wasn't his intent at all, but it just went off like wildfire. Another thing that came about from this was this prophetic interpretation. And because of reading the scriptures, which Luther originally thought that the book of Revelation, that was just nonsense, it wasn't scripture, it needed to be thrown out. And then he translated the book of Daniel, and now it started to make sense to him. He started to connect the dots. And then he wrote a Revelation commentary after that. And that also sparked a chain of where they began to see that the events of Revelation had been being magnificently fulfilled in their history. And these things have been going on ever since the 1st century. Today, we're taught that it's all in the future. And this is a scheme, and we're going to see that admitted by the people who purported the scheme. This interpretation of the scripture that the reformers came up with, what is called the historicist interpretation. And really, it began with the first seal. First seal was actually opened, although we're taught it's future. The first seal is actually opened practically before John's ink was dry on the paper. It came about like that, just like John was told. He was told that these things are things that are shortly to come to pass. And that's what happened. Practically no sooner was the ink dry that this stuff started to happen. But we're taught it's all out in the future, and we can't get that out of our mind. It's so ingrained that when you hear something like this, it's like, oh, well, you must be wrong because that's not what everybody else says. Well, everybody else is taught, and they're intentionally taught, a faulty view of Scripture, a faulty scholarship. It's intentional. So the Reformation, the things that happened, and the way the Scriptures were translated, they began to see that the Antichrist was among them. We're taught, oh, it's future. But they saw that the Antichrist was among them and had been among them, and that even for centuries before, people were writing that the Pope was the Antichrist. Even back in the 1100s, the Waldenses, he was saying the Pope was the Antichrist. The Pope was the Antichrist. And that became the unifying thing of the Reformation. The Pope was the Antichrist. And we're going to see this admitted by one of the greatest proponents of this futurist ideology. Rome wasn't going to just take this line down. They started a counter-reformation, pretty much about 20-something years after the Reformation had sparked. In 1517, by 1541, they had a counter-reformation going. So what we're going to have here is a tale of two priests. And the first one is, typically he's called Alcazar. It's Luis de Alcazar. And so he writes this work where he takes all the events of Revelation, throws them all into the past. Nero's the Antichrist. Everything happens in the book of Revelation by AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and the Jews being taken back into exile. So everything happens by then. So that's what Alcazar's interpretation was about. And we're going to come back to this here in a few minutes. This is Francisco Ribera. He also writes a work where he takes all the events of Revelation, throws them all into the future. And what this does is it takes the spotlight off of the Pope of being the Antichrist. So these guys are part of the Counter-Reformation. They say, oh, it's all in the future, so it can't be the Pope. So that was the point, and we're going to see that admitted here in a few minutes by a particular man who's been instrumental in us all believing that everything's future. So from Ribera, you have Cardinal Bellarmine here. He continues the work, picks up the torch, keeps it going. And then you have this guy, Manuel de la Cunza, and he writes a particular work, and he ascribes this work to a pseudonym, which is a Jewish pseudonym. So in the book, he claims to be a Jewish convert to Christianity. And so then he picks up this futurist interpretation torch in that. And what was going on was Ribera, he did his work, and that quickly became the official position of the Catholic Church, that, oh, the Pope's not the Antichrist, it's all in the future. Of course. So the reformers were like, yeah, nice try, we ain't buying it. And so same with Bellarmine, no, not buying it. So Lacunza comes along, he's like, okay, we'll create a pen name, pseudonym here, and we'll claim to be a converted Jew, and they'll listen to a converted Jew. Well, that wasn't going so well either, and I think it kind of got discovered, found out. So this particular work, it's this right here, and Lacunza on the page, and so then it's re-authored by Manuel de la Cunza and Edward Irving. So here we have Edward Irving being connected to this Counter-Reformation. And so Edward Irving here, that throws everything he ever says into suspect, and of course he's of pre-tribulation rapture fame as well. He has this connection here and co-authoring this book and his name here on the book with Lacunza. This scheme wasn't working out. The Protestants weren't buying it, so they had to get a Protestant involved, or somebody who was pretending to be a Protestant. Don't know if that's actually the case with Edward Irving, but it has to be suspect. After Edward Irving, then down the line, Darby, John Nelson Darby, he picks this up too and starts to carry the torch that Ribera lit. So he continues on with this Counter-Reformation ideology, whether it's intentional or he's just influenced behind the scenes. So that leads us then also to C.I. Scofield, continues that as well, carrying the torch for this Counter-Reformation ideology that points away from the ideology of the Reformers, in that the scripture was historically fulfilled and that the Pope is the Antichrist. So then Scofield, of Scofield Reference Bible fame, he then, when he dies, then this man, Louis Sperry Schaeffer, takes over the pastorate of his church. And so Schaeffer, he goes along to start a seminary, which then this seminary it changes names and it becomes Dallas Theological Seminary. And Dallas Theological continues to keep this torch going that Ribera started, and teaching this futurist ideology of Scripture. And pretty much most everybody on TV, televangelists that you know, and notable pastors, most all of them either been and got a degree at Dallas Theological, got an honorary degree, or had some kind of laudation through Dallas Theological Seminary. And so, we came through Darby, through Scofield, through Schaefer, and Woolvard, Lindsay, Tim LaHaye. These guys all connected back to Dallas Theological. This is part of the pathway of how this came along. But also, going back a little bit to the time of Scofield, you have this guy, Clarence Larkin. His book that he wrote is basically like the Book of Mormon for dispensational futurism, or the Bible, if you will, for different dispensational futurism. And this work is dispensational truth. And typically when they got to put the name truth into the particular work, then all of a sudden it's not truth. Typically it's not. When you got to say truth, it's not truth. And such is the case going on here. And Larkin even admits it in the preface, which we're fixing to take a look at. So here, in his preference, he mentions the preterist school, and it originated with Alcazar. His view, he says, was first put forth as a complete scheme. And then over here he says, the purpose of the scheme was transparent. It was to relieve the papal church from the stigma of being called the harlot church and the Pope from being called the Antichrist. Preterism is a view that is now but little advocated. So right here, he says that Alcazar creating preterism, that it was a scheme to take the spotlight off of the Pope. Then he talks about the historical school, as he says, which is what the reformers believed. And he says this school has had some very able and ingenious advocates. And so I'm not going to read all that part. And then this is the continuation of that paragraph. And so then he gets to the futurist school. And he says the futurist school interprets the language of the apocalypse or Revelation literally, except where such symbols are named as such, and holds that the whole book from the end of the 3rd chapter is yet future and unfulfilled, and the greater part of the book from the beginning of the 6th chapter to the end of the 19th describes what shall come to pass during the last week of, quote, Daniel's 70 weeks, which this future of Daniel's 70 weeks, that was never something that was understood by the reformers, and it was concocted by Ribera. This view, while it dates in modern times only from the close of the 16th century, which is when Ribera did his work, close of the 16th century, the late 1500s. This view, while it dates in modern times only from the close of the 16th century, is really the most ancient of the three, which is not true. Where he gets this is that in the early writings of the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th century, when they wrote things about Revelation, some thought, John's talking about things in his present time and things that had to do with the Roman Empire. And then others thought, well, he's writing about things in the future. So John's future is our past. So such was the same thing with Ribera. His future was past. And the same thing with Larkin. John's future was their past. But here where Larkin says it's really the most ancient of the three, he surely refers to that the early writers talk about that John may be writing about things in the future. But again, his future was our past. It says it was held in many of its prominent features by the primitive fathers of the church, and is one of the early interpretations of scripture truth that sunk into oblivion with the growth of the papacy, and that has been restored to the church of these last times. Which again, not true. Yeah, early writers talked about it being future, but future to them is our past. And the things that they wrote didn't intend for it to say that it was so far way off in the future. And another thing, like Daniel, when he wrote his prophecies, he's told to seal it up for many days in the future. All the things that Daniel prophesied about began to come to pass when the Messiah came in the first century. So from the time of Daniel to Messiah, about 600 years. So 600 years, he says many days in the future. Well, John's told not to seal it up for the times at hand. Well, now it's 2,000 years later and the time's still at hand. When 600 years is many days in the future, but 2,000 is at hand, something's amiss here. And it's the scholarship that we've been handed down. So here, Larkin says, in its present form, it may be said to have originated at the end of the 16th century with the Jesuit Ribera. Well, Ribera, at the end of the 16th century, writes this. So here, Larkin is saying and admitting that futurism in its present form may be said to have originated at the end of the 16th century with the Jesuit Ribera, who actuated by the same motive as the Jesuit Alcazar, who sought to rid the papacy of the stigma of being called the Antichrist, and so referred to the prophecies of the apocalypse to the distant future. So right there, he's saying it right there that this stuff comes from what Ribera wrote, and that he just called what Alcazar wrote, he called it a scheme to take the spotlight off of the Pope. And he says that Ribera actuated on the same scheme to take the spotlight off of the Pope being called the Antichrist. So he's connecting this, and he's saying that this futurist ideal is a scheme to take the spotlight off of the Pope. And then here at the end he says, the futurist interpretation of Scripture is the one that's employed in this book. So Ribera's scheme to take the spotlight off of the Pope is exactly what Clarence Larkin put forth, and that is why you believe that what I'm saying is not true, because you bought the lie. Psalm 89:34. My covenant I will not break, nor alter the word that has gone out of my lips. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up. Comment down below. Comments of opposition are welcome. Just don't say anything dumb like we're not under the law. We're under grace, because you've been taught to use that verse outside of the bounds of its intended context. Subscribe now. Hit that subscribe button and ring that bell so that you get notifications of all future videos.